Have you ever felt like the world simply forgot you were still here? Not in some dramatic, falling through the cracks kind of way. No, I mean the quiet kind. The kind that sneaks up on you like dusk, so slow, so gradual, that you don't even realize it's night until the room is dark and no one's turned on the light. There was a time when my days were filled with sound. The phone would ring, sometimes 2 or 3 times before breakfast. Old friends checking in, my kids asking for advice, a neighbor needing a hand with the car battery, or a friend from the church just wanting to hear my voice. It made me feel useful, important, connected. But then, without warning, or maybe with too much of it, the calls started to fade. First it was the weekly check-in that became monthly. Then the birthday that slipped someone's mind. Then, nothing. At first, I told myself everyone's just busy. That this is how life works. Children grow up, people drift, time pulls the tide of attention elsewhere. And that's true. But what no one tells you is how quiet it all becomes once you're no longer in the center of someone's daily orbit. I'd walk into my kitchen and hear only the hum of the refrigerator. I'd sit on the front porch, where I used to wave at folks driving by, and realize I hadn't seen a familiar face all week. And that silence. It isn't just the absence of noise. It's the absence of being needed, of being seen. And after a while, it begins to whisper things to you, things you try not to believe. Maybe I've already lived the part of my life that mattered. Maybe the world's moved on, and left me sitting here in the past. I won't lie to you, that thought scared me more than anything else ever had. But this is not a story about fear. It's a story about what happens next. About what you find when the phone stops ringing, and the silence becomes your companion instead of your enemy. Because in that quiet, I discovered something I never expected. And that is where the story truly begins. There was a time when every day felt full, not just with activity, but with meaning. I was the one people turned to when things got tough. The voice they called when life got noisy and confusing. Ask him, they'd say. He always knows what to do. And most days I did. There's a strange kind of joy in being needed. It's not loud or flashy. It's steady, like the low hum of an engine that keeps a whole machine running. I was the one who showed up early to help set up the tables, stayed late to carry the last box. The one who remembered birthdays, who listened without rushing, who held space for others when they didn't know how to hold it for themselves. At home, I was the fixer of broken doors, the reader of bedtime stories, the one who knew exactly when to speak, and just as importantly, when not to. I was the compass when the family lost direction, the calm when life got stormy. And in all that doing, all that helping, I found identity. But here's the thing I didn't see back then. When you're always the strong one, people start to believe you never need anything yourself. That you're made of something different. But the truth is, I was drawing from a well I never thought would run dry. And maybe I didn't notice how deeply I'd tied my worth to being that rock. When people stop calling, it's not just the phone that goes quiet. It's your sense of value. Your sense of place. I remember waking up one morning, looking at the calendar, and realizing there was nothing on it. Not for the day, not for the week. That used to be unthinkable. And yet, here I was. I didn't resent anyone. Life has a way of shifting. I knew that. Children become parents. Friends move or pass on. Even the busiest lives eventually slow down. But knowing it doesn't make it hurt any less when it happens. I asked myself, if I'm no longer the one holding everyone together, who am I now? That's a hard question, especially when you've spent most of your life being the answer for someone else. But what I would come to learn, slowly, quietly, is that there's a deeper kind of worth. One that doesn't come from being called on, but from choosing to show up anyway. That lesson didn't come all at once. No, it arrived like the morning light through old curtains, soft, gradual, but unmistakably there. And it all began with the silence. The very silence I feared. The next chapter of this story starts with a fight I didn't expect. A fight not with the world, but with myself. And that silence, it crept into me. At first, it was just around me. In the still mornings where the phone stayed silent, in the evenings when the house felt too big for one man's footsteps. But after a while, that quiet began to settle in my chest. Not loud, not sharp, just there. A kind of ache you can't quite name. I tried to fill it, of course. I think most of us do. I turned on the television, the news, the weather, even those old courtroom shows where people yell over borrowed money and broken toasters. I kept the radio on while I made breakfast, kept the lights on longer than I needed, just to feel something. But noise isn't the same as meaning. You see, when you've spent your whole life being busy, being useful, being someone to someone, the sudden stillness can feel like a kind of failure. A punishment, even. As if you've been benched in a game you didn't know was still going. I remember one afternoon, I sat down in my favorite chair, the one by the window, with the cushion that's molded to me just right, and I stared at the wall. Not at a show, not at a book, just stared. And I thought to myself, is this it? Is this all there is left for me now? That question, it rattled around inside me like an echo in an empty room. The truth is, it wasn't about boredom. It was about purpose. I didn't miss the noise itself. I missed what the noise meant. A phone call wasn't just a ring, it was proof that someone out there still thought of me, still needed me. And when that disappeared, I started to wonder if I had anything left to give. I won't pretend I found an answer quickly. I didn't. I tried to outrun the stillness, filled the house with background chatter, made lists just to cross things off, even convinced myself I might just need a new hobby. But distraction is a temporary fix for a deeper hunger. What I really needed, though I didn't know it yet, was to stop avoiding the silence and start listening to it. Because buried inside that quiet was a voice I hadn't heard in a long, long time. My own. And once I finally sat with it, truly sat with it, that's when everything began to shift. The next part of this journey. It's not about the emptiness. It's about what you find when you stop running from it. Stop, stop, stop. Before we continue, I want to take a brief pause. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching or listening from? And have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? A moment when you realized something had to change? If this story speaks to you, I invite you to subscribe. There's more to come, and I'd be honored to have you on this journey. Now, let's continue. I used to believe that life's great turning points came like thunderclaps, loud, dramatic, impossible to miss. But in truth, some of the most important changes arrive quietly. For me, it wasn't a moment of crisis. It wasn't a phone call or a burst of clarity. It was a quiet morning like any other. I was sipping lukewarm coffee in that same worn chair by the window, watching a single leaf spiral down from an old oak tree. And out of nowhere, a thought came to me. No one's coming. Not in a bitter way. Not with sadness. Just honest. No one was going to knock on my door and hand me purpose wrapped in a bow. No one was going to fill my days for me. If I wanted meaning, I had to make it, with my own two hands and whatever heart I had left to give. And so, I did something small. I walked to the little community library down the road, the one I used to take my grandkids to, back when their legs were short and their eyes full of questions. I didn't have a plan. I just asked if they needed help. Turns out, they did. That's how it began. I started shelving books, then reading to kids during story hour. At first, I felt awkward, like a guest in someone else's life. But something happened as I watched those young faces light up at the sound of my voice. I started to feel present. They didn't care how many years were behind me. They didn't ask what I used to do, or who used to call me. They just wanted the story. And slowly, I began to see. I still had something to offer. That shift didn't stop at the library. I started jotting down my own memories, little stories from my youth, things my father used to say, the smell of my mother's kitchen. I wrote them not because I thought anyone would read them, but because they mattered to me. Creation, even in the smallest form, is a kind of resurrection. It reminds you that life isn't just something that happens to you. It's something you can shape. The world may not have been calling, but that didn't mean I had nothing left to say. And once I realized that, once I stopped waiting for someone else to give my life direction, that's when I truly began to live again. Now, what came next was more than activity. It was connection. The kind that runs deeper than words. Deeper than attention. And that is what I'll share with you in the next chapter. I used to think purpose had to be loud. That it had to come with applause or titles, or at the very least, acknowledgement. But as the days passed, I began to understand something far more lasting. Some of the most meaningful moments in life are the quietest. There was no fanfare when I read a storybook aloud in that little library room. Just a circle of children on a rug, their eyes wide, their hands sticky from lunchtime snacks. But when I opened those pages and let the words roll from my tongue, they listened. Really listened. And in their stillness, I felt seen. Not as someone who was, but as someone who is. That, right there, was a new kind of connection. It wasn't built on obligation or history. It didn't rely on memories of who I had been. It existed only in that moment. Shared breath, shared words, shared presence. And I found more of that in other places, too. I started visiting a senior home nearby. Not because anyone asked me to, no one did, but because I remembered how it felt to sit in silence and wonder if anyone remembered you existed. I'd knock gently, walk in, and sit beside strangers who felt familiar in their aloneness. Sometimes we'd talk about old films, or music from a time when radios had dials and the world moved slower. Other times, we wouldn't say much at all. Just being there was enough. Presence, real presence. doesn't demand attention. It offers attention. It says, I see you, even without words. And I began to realize, purpose isn't something you achieve and hang on a wall. It's something you give, a little at a time, over and over, helping a young boy learn how to sound out a new word, holding a trembling hand during a tough day, writing down a story, not because anyone asked for it, but because someone, someday, might need it. In that quiet, I found meaning. Not because the world was looking at me, but because I was looking at the world again, slowly, openly, and without expectation. What I'd once seen as emptiness had become space. Space to give. Space to grow. And that's when I understood, life doesn't stop being rich just because the phone stops ringing. Sometimes, that's when it finally starts speaking to you. Clearly, gently, and with great purpose. Now, I know this may not sound flashy. It may not be what we once dreamed of when we thought about what growing older would look like. But let me tell you, there is peace in it. There is depth. There is life. And in the final chapter, I'll share with you what that life has taught me, and what it might just reveal to you, too. Sometimes, the greatest chapter begins after the world stops calling. I didn't know that when the silence first settled in, all I could feel back then was the absence of voices, of motion, of meaning. I thought the best parts of my life were already behind me, written and sealed, like old letters tucked away in a drawer. But now I see, the silence wasn't the end. It was an invitation, not to mourn what was lost, but to notice what had been waiting all along. You see, we live in a world that moves fast. And as we get older, it's easy to believe that if we're no longer needed, we're no longer valued. But I've learned that being unseen doesn't mean being unworthy. In fact, some of the most important work we'll ever do happens when no one is watching. The quiet held gifts I never expected. It taught me how to listen, not just to others but to myself. It showed me that meaning doesn't come from attention. It comes from intention. From the small acts we choose to give, day after day, when there's no spotlight and no audience. So if you're listening to this, sitting in your own quiet kitchen, or walking through your own still house, I want you to hear me clearly. You still matter. You matter in the way your stories live on in others. You matter in the wisdom you carry, even if no one's asked for it lately. You matter because you are still here, and there is still life in you yet. Don't let the silence fool you. Don't let a quiet phone convince you that you've reached the end. Because some chapters don't begin with a call. They begin with a choice. A choice to show up, to create, to care, to listen. That's what I did. One small choice at a time. And now, looking back, I can say this with peace in my heart. This chapter, the one I'm living right now, it may just be the richest one yet. So I invite you to begin again, in your own way, with your own voice. The world may have grown quiet, but that only makes your story easier to hear. And I, for one, would love to listen. If this story spoke to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever gone through a time when the world felt quiet, maybe too quiet? Have you found new meaning in places you didn't expect? You matter more than you know, and your story matters, too. I believe in every one of you watching this. If you'd like to hear more heartfelt, motivating stories like this one, consider subscribing and giving this video a like. That way, you won't miss what's coming next. Wishing you a peaceful and meaningful day. And if you've made it this far, write this in the comments so I know you're one of the ones who stayed with me till the end. I still matter.